kind of decorative aspects to the building, and I think you'll see on the slide here 4-foot-high masonry wainscoting on it, and the entrance areas are using some kind of stained wood type accents to it that makes it really quite an attractive building. The location of this is what we're kind of calling a corner lot. It's actually in a bend of South Pine Street, and as it makes this sweeping bend and straightens out, it actually changed the name of the street to Southeast 3rd Avenue. And if you keep going a little further, it bends again and it changed into South Redwood Street. So, you know, we had nothing to do with that, the current planners, but, you know, same street with 3 different names as it changes the curves. This site is considered a redevelopment of the property because this aerial here shows you that there's an existing house on the property, that being right here. And that is projected to be demolished. And in doing such, there's a couple conditions of approval to make sure that they get their permit through Clackamas County to do the demolition, and that they close out and properly plug or remove the utility services that were going to that existing house. So that's part of the demolition process as well. The use that's proposed as basically a warehouse facility. It could also house uses that are allowed in the light industrial zone district, you know, possibly a fabrication type business or any other use that would be allowed in the M1 zone. One of the normal requirements in an M1 zone when you're building a warehouse or light industrial building is to have a loading bay. And that was one of the difficulties in laying out the design for this particular site and trying to fit both the required parking, the needed building space, and also put a loading space. And so one of the unique provisions is that they're actually, the applicant who's in the audience tonight, Mike Patterson, has indicated that there's the same ownership of the property to the east here where Oregon Machine Works is located. And there's going to be a dedicated parking space, or loading space, I mean, over here on the adjacent property. The development code talks quite a bit about various shared parking arrangements, and if you can do proper legal documents to guarantee when parking is shared on an adjacent property, that you can do those types of things. We want to be very sure that it's tied with the properties so that if the ownership should ever change hands, that it's known that that parking space that's on another tax lot, another separate property that could be sold separately and owned differently in the future, will have a document that's filed of record in the courthouse that would show up in title searches so people know they have an obligation to continue to accommodate a parking space that is off of the subject property. So there's nothing in the code that specifically addresses that for loading spots, just parking in general. So staff feels like with the appropriate legal document that we could consider this. It's not often that you have an adjacent property owned by the same person that's also an industrial use and that would happen to have a space available for a full-size loading space, and that's what we end up having in this case. Maybe I'll go on to another drawing here. Just another This is basically our zoning map that shows you that across the street to the west is the fire station in a C2 zone. Down south is high-density residential use. There's a manufactured park across the street to the south. And then you have other M1 zoning to the east and to the north of this site. This is one of the site plans, indicates all of the different elements that are proposed here. There's 2 suites, one over here and one over here, and there's a separate entrance here from the Pine Street that are recessed in, that have the different treatment. I'll show you in a minute. And right up here is where they're saying access to an adjacent existing shared loading stall that will be by agreement, that will be recorded. So it's nearby, and they're able to cross the property boundary in a paved area that's along the back of this building and access through self doors that are in the back of these 2 units here. So I'm not sure, and I don't know if they know for sure who they're leasing these to at this particular time. This next site plan was rendered and so shows things up a little bit easier, so you can see the 2 covered entryways at the front, recessed, and then doors here in the back. As you mentioned, it was 9,420 square feet total. So you kind of divide that in half. They look like equal multi-tenant spaces. Because they're located on this curve, the biggest obstacle was locating a structure on this site, and even more so, a driveway that would allow visibility when you're pulling out onto the street when you look both directions. And where the driveway is proposed was recommended by the traffic study that was applicant paid for by DKS, our consulting traffic engineers. They explored alternative driveway locations as far to the north right here, and looked at a location down here as well. But there were site limitations in one direction on both of those driveways that did not meet accepted standards. So the solution that DKS recommended was to place a driveway right in the curve. And it seemed quite counterintuitive, not only to the applicant, but to staff as well, as that being a safe place to put a driveway. I don't know that I've ever seen that in a brand new development anywhere. But we did quite a bit of discussion with DKS on that recommendation, and they absolutely insisted that this is the only location they would recommend for a driveway, because it is safer at that location to enter and exit, because you can actually look both directions and see if anyone's coming. And that's most important when you're pulling out left to turn. But it can also be important when you're turning right if somebody's coming around the bend really fast and you didn't see them. This driveway has a potential to be as wide as 40 feet wide. That's the maximum our code allows. We have one standard that says 36 feet now, so we have a conflict in our codes, but at some point we'll decide on which of those 2 standards we're going to be keeping. But since we have both, it's up to the applicant whether they get a 36-foot wide or a 40-foot wide drive in that location. What they found is by the proposed parking, I believe there's 11 parking spaces on here with a couple compact spaces down here on the end, is that there was no place for a large truck to come in and not have to back out, which would be very dangerous at this location. So we indicated that that's never going to work, and they could not get that truck turned around with all these cars parked inside here. And that might be the case, is a truck coming when there's cars parked. So that's when they started thinking about this alternative place for the loading bay on the adjacent property. And so it has the added benefit of reducing the safety hazards and the functionality of their own site here, not having to worry about a large truck coming in and mingling with the parking spaces. It also hides, which is a goal of putting your loading bays in the back, or at least to the side of your buildings. And so it actually does that in this case. It's just not on the same property. There's two lines on this drawing. This line right here, and where it converges at the point here in the middle of the driveway and then goes this way. They had to keep the edge point of the building out of that in order to maintain the sight distance. In addition, there's often some thought of putting some sort of ground or pole sign out near the driveway. And in this particular instance, that's not wise because it becomes a sight distance barrier. And normally we have street trees going along this sidewalk in this landscaped area. And they originally had those. And we said, no, now we've just defeated what we were after in the traffic study of maintaining the sight distance. So the only place they were able to place the trees are exactly where they're shown here, little green circles. And a light colored green does add up to the very minimum landscape percentage of 15% that the light industrial zone requires, because they ended up paving most of the back of this here too. So they have met all of those landscape requirements. They've met all the parking space requirements. And I'll go on to the next slide. And they have a relatively attractive kind of industrial type building. And as you can see, these two entrances here and the treatment they have around them with the recessed just makes them a little bit more of an attractive way. And you can see how they've tried to make them as useful to whoever might want to lease a space, whether it's for storage or some other light industrial use. And then you see the back. This is the end on Southeast 3rd Avenue, where in front of it is the stormwater swale or rain garden detention facility for water treatment. And the other end has no openings on it whatsoever. This was just showing you those sight distance lines again. It showed up better on the other one. I'll go to the conditions. I think I mentioned most of these. Is going to see the city engineer. We had no written public input on this particular, other than comments from our city engineer. So we've got a condition of approval that they meet those. I think there was a list of about seven of those. I think we included that email that came on in the packet. They're pretty typical construction type requirements, nothing unusual. Did mention that the applicant is probably only going to use wall signs, and they have not proposed that at this time, maybe because they don't know who the tenants are. So they'll just meet with this condition, the requirements of the sign code to get those wall signs in the future. And yeah, as far as I know, I think we're kind of saying that this should not have a ground sign or a pole sign because it's just not suitable in the sight distance areas. Then we talked about a recorded easement agreement for the loading bay that would be shared on the adjacent property. And so the intent is for the applicant to utilize their attorney to draw up a document that would be suitable, that guarantees for this property and includes the other property that it's going to be located on, that they're both fully aware of the individual property's responsibility. And where their parking space is on the one that we're reviewing, and on the other property's responsibility to maintain that even in the future when the property might change hands. Anything different than that would have to come back before the Planning Commission in some way to see if some alternative would work out. And I'm not sure what that would be, since a loading bay doesn't really fit well on the property itself. And we mentioned the demolition permit that would be necessary. So with that in mind, staff concluded that it did conform with all of the zoning ordinance criteria. The site can adequately accommodate the proposed use. All the necessary public services are available. And we do recommend approval of DR 1804, subject to the conditions in the staff report.
Thank you, Brian. Any questions for Brian? Okay. Just in the report here, I made a note that, if I can find it quickly enough. So there were, on page 53, it says the pre-application conferences for this project were held on the 31st of October in 2018. Today being June of 2018.
Obviously a typo.
Yeah, and the one down below on the neighborhood meeting. I'm assuming that was 2017, but as long as it's part of the written record.
That sounds like it would be right if it was 2017.
But I thought that as far as the written record, we should have that corrected. Okay? Well, you know, when I have the little red Post-it thingies on here, that means I've read it. So they don't always have it on there. Then I might not have any questions. Okay, we'll open this up to the proponents. If you'll step forward, name and address, please.
And bring up their slide program so they can talk for a minute.
You want to introduce yourself first?
I'm Mike Patterson, the applicant. I live on 1078 North Grant Street. And
Scott Beck, architect, 361 Northeast 3rd Avenue, Canby is my office. Apologize for the typo on the meetings. Okay, so this first slide, again, is an aerial. It indicates those traffic sight lines that were recommended to follow by DKS. They were, I believe, 335 feet of distance. And I, plotted them as if you were sitting in your car driving in the driver's position. So I tried to position the line, roughly in the lane of travel where that would occur. And it emanates from the apex of the curve there at the site access. And you can see that the top knot building even, is just slightly outside that line. Buildings to the north are well outside of it. Next slide, please. This is a diagram where I've rotated the property 90 degrees, so true north would be to the left. And it illustrates a over-the-road, truck, like with a 45-foot trailer pulling in onto the site at that access point. And then to the left indicates how a truck would leave the site if you were allowed to have a second access onto Pine Street. And typically in any project, you strive to have through travel, whether you could either loop around within your on-site circulation or a secondary curb cut where you could leave the site. So initial site studies tried to provide, two ways in and out or a right out only. When the traffic report came back, it was quite specific that not only did you only have to have the one access at the corner, you could not have any other right out travel movements off the site. So this diagram shows what would happen then if you tried to turn a truck around on that property. You can see that it pretty much eats up a good part of the site, And so by having this single access at that one specific spot, it creates somewhat of a hardship for the property as far as, being able to develop it and put some limitations on it. So we kind of had to scratch our head as, how could we address that? And that's where we came up with that idea of the off-site loading. Next slide, please. So again, this is an aerial, indicates Mr. Patterson's property there to the east. And the red arrows indicate the travel of a truck coming in, going through that Oregon Machine Works site, and then exiting on the east side. And then the blue arrows represent, loading, forklift loading, unloading of goods and product to and from the various businesses. And then to the left there, indicating the position of a shared access to the rear of the site. And again, that's what we're proposing in this project. Next slide. Again, you've seen this one. It indicated that line and then the position of the access. So the upper left there indicates the loading stall. And then we've proposed like a 30-foot gate opening, really no gate, but just an opening on the rear of this property that would allow fork truck traffic to come from the rear doors of the building. There's also a man door proposed on the rear doors to allow easy access and movement back and forth from the properties. And as Brian mentioned, the benefit of it obviously is that we don't have to concern ourselves with people backing onto Pine Street. And also it is very well hidden and screened from public view located on that property. Next slide. Another shot of the site plan. So other specifics about the project that I might point out. Let's see if this is working. Along the north wall here, we're proposing to build relatively close to the property line, within a matter of inches. And so we're proposing a 1-hour firewall with a fire parapet, and there'll be no openings, no doors, no windows on that wall. This back wall is, I believe, 10 foot 1 inches from that easterly property line. And then we have other setbacks along the buffer. I've forgotten, I think this was 6 feet from the property line, but there's also additional landscape beyond that in the right-of-way. And again, on the south end, we're proposing a storm swale rain garden. And the purpose of that, there's a central ridge line down the middle of the building. The back half of the building, the rainwater will pitch to the rear and be collected by a gutter, which will then go through downspouts, pipe, and then pipe over to this swale, which water will percolate, and then if it did overflow, it would overflow to a drain, to a dry well over here. Storm drainage of the parking area, it sheet flows to the front, it's collected by catch basins, piped over to a manhole, and then again to a common dry well, in this position. As far as pedestrian access, we're proposing one right here that's common with the handicap access aisle over to the building, and then a secondary one along the westerly edge of the building that connects over here. Brian had mentioned too, in order to break the building up, we are proposing a 5-foot indent in the center with a masonry divider fin right here that kind of defines these two entrances and provides some cover in the inclement weather. Next slide. So again, Brian had mentioned this. We're proposing a pre-engineered steel building with pre-finished metal wall and roof panels, 16-foot eave, and then I think these are 12-foot tall doors, 14 by 12, is that?
I think so, yeah.
2 of them. And then at the ends, we've got a service man door for egress and exit. And above those doors, we've also included transom window that kind of adds some interest to the building and provides some natural light to the working areas. The main entrances to the office suites have storefront windows and doors to give them some exposure. This view here is the side view of those areas here. This one is the masonry fin in the center from the side. This view is the end walls here and here of the office entrances. And again, this view here would be south facing toward what's 3rd Street, I guess, around the corner. And then the bottom view is the back of the building that illustrates the man doors and the overhead doors that would service the off-site loading. Next slide. So here's some enlarged details. Again, the signage, we don't know who will be the tenants, but the drawings do illustrate sign areas and numbers that are within the sign code as far as wall signs are concerned. Next. Another enlarged. So I'm showing a sign on the south end that would be allowed. I think you're allowed 1 sign per frontage up to a maximum area. Next slide. This is the civil drawing showing utilities. Won't bore you too much, but all utilities are available. This illustrates how the overflow piping from the storm swale would overflow and pipe toward the dry well, and then how the catch basins would tie back to a manhole and then to that same dry well. Next. Grading plan. The storm swale itself, I believe, is 2.5 feet deep on the building side, and it's slightly deeper toward the public side. So if it did, for some reason, plug up and overflow, it would, go more toward the building side than to the street. We're proposing that the sidewalks be basically flush with the interior of the building, and likewise that the asphalt paving in front has about a 1/2 inch lip between it and the grade of the sidewalk for easy access and movement. About a 3.5% slope across the crosswalk, and then flatter in the handicap parking areas. Next. This is a landscape plan. It's pretty hard to read, but the trees that are proposed we're required to have 7 trees, and it's a tree, I believe it's a river birch is kind of a common name. It's somewhat of a paper bark birch. The other plants are a variety of barberries, blue oak grass, some nice interesting plants. Along the street, it was unusual again because we can't have street trees. And so there had to be some creative thinking about how you add some interest and screen the vehicles, but nothing that's too tall. And I think landscape architects has done a fairly good job. It's not a real pretty picture, but I think if you really studied it, that the materials make sense, and I think they'll look nice once planted. I think that's about all I have. Do you have any questions of the basic?
Questions?
You want to speak a little bit about property and your thoughts about
Right now, there's a really old, bad house there that we think this will be, the reason I bought the property is I own the other buildings around it, and it's just been an eyesore forever. I thought, well, hey, I can finish out the park. It's it's supposed to be an industrial park. It'll look better. It'll raise the tax base. It just made sense. I tried to tie it in the same colors as the other building, the same kind of look, but yet it's a little more commercial possibly, so we tried to do a little better on the front, I think. We tried to dress up the front more than the other buildings.
Yeah, I think, it could be a very simple, plain industrial building that would fly and meet code, but we tried to go a little bit, beyond that and add to the character of the area. That area is changing. I mean, the fire station's been a nice building for quite a while. The new utility board building, is a nice building, and I suspect there's a piece of property across from that, next to that software developer. I don't know what's going to go in there, but at some point,
That's
you know,
for
that-
sale now. Yeah.
that will develop. And so, I think this is a nice touch to clean that area up and give it a little bit more of a commercial feel, rather than just a, shop, basically.
Any questions? Actually, I did, it's a matter of curiosity, because you have the two doors in the, bay doors in the front. Are those for, since you can't have big trucks in there, is that for like delivery vans?
Feel like a delivery van, we thought, because one of the possible tenants is an Amazon distributor, and they would just probably bring big trucks in the rear, but then load up the little minivans or whatever, and then be able to drive out. Just want to keep it very universal, trying to keep it flexible.
Sometimes for ventilation too, in a, industrial type building, they're not really heated or cooled well. And so in the hot part of the season, it's nice to crack the doors and allow air movement. He does that now in
Yeah,
his
we do it in our
buildings. And so
shop.
that was one of the original ideas, even before the loading issue came up, was to have cross ventilation through the building. But yeah, the intent would be that, anything coming out the front would be small goods to smaller vehicles.
Any questions? Any more questions? Thank you very much. Thanks. Okay. Did your job. Are there any other proponents, people that would like to speak in favor of this development? Are there any opponents that would like to speak against the development? Is there anybody here that would like to speak that is considered neutral? Hence, no rebuttal. Good for you.
Avery, there's two other points that I failed to mention. They're a little bit unique on this one. They are generally using xeriscaping in their landscape, drought-tolerant type plants. And because of that, they're not proposing an irrigation system. The code allows that if you can have hose bibs within 150 feet of all the landscaping. And so it is critical where they place outdoor hose bibs that it meets that code requirement. And so I wanted you to be aware of that. We've only had a couple developments that have not done actual irrigation systems. One of the ones, it's turned out relatively good now, but it actually failed the first season, was the Dragonberry Produce Building out in the industrial park. They had an elaborate irrigation system set up that was temporary. Unfortunately, the minute they took it down, there was a drought and everything died. They gradually have gotten the proper landscaping back. And we've had a couple very small developments that have utilized the hose bib provision. The other is, and it's not unique either, but this building, and they're hoping the type of tenants are able to wheel trash dumpsters, hand carts, out to the sidewalk along 3rd Avenue on trash pickup day. And we do have some industrial commercial uses that do that rather than having a built-in trash enclosure. And that was somewhat difficult to site on this property because of all the limitations that would be accessible to a trash truck. Therefore, they're proposing those carts. I wanted you to be aware of that as well.
Assume that there are hose bibs. Okay, at this time, we'll close the public testimony. Are there any questions that we might have, Brian, or any further discussion? Okay, then I will entertain a motion to approve DR 18-04 Patterson multi-tenant project.
Mr. Chair, I move that we approve DR 18-04 Patterson multi-tenant project.
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay. That is done. Thank you very much. When are you going to break ground? Sounds like fun. Okay, thank you. Okay, next issue is the final decision. I will entertain a motion for a final decision for DR 18-04 Patterson multi-tenant.
Mr. Chair, I move that we approve the final decision for the final findings for DR 18-04 Patterson multi-tenant.
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay. So, Brian, any items of interest or a report from you?
We did indicate on the agenda that the next regular meeting will be July 9th. And at that meeting, we have the Canby Townhomes development at 1300 South Ivy Street. And we have garnered quite a bit of input from the neighbors on that
Imagine you would.
particular process, and it does involve 4 different applications in order to make their proposed project work out.
All righty, so we'll be meeting here on the 9th. Can everybody make that?
I should see no problem.
Yeah. Okay.
I might mention also, Laney reminded me that today we received an appeal of the Beck Pond subdivision to the city council. It was made by Mr. Steinke.
Well, that's going to go before the city council.
So it'll be scheduled for July 18th, city council public hearing.
In which case it may or may not come back to us. Good thinking. So are there any items of interest or guidance from the planning commission for Brian and Laney? Okay. I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
Mr. Chair, I
I'd like to
move we
make a
adjourn the
motion that we
meeting.
adjourn.
And we have a second. So
Yeah. In stereo.
all in favor say aye.
Aye.
We are adjourned.